The small town of Silverwood was quiet, nestled deep in a valley surrounded by dense forests. The townsfolk were accustomed to the stillness of their nights, interrupted only by the occasional rustling of leaves or the distant howl of a wolf. But every year, on the last night of October, the tranquility was shattered by the arrival of the midnight train. No one knew where the train came from or where it was going. It had been a local legend for as long as anyone could remember, a ghostly locomotive that appeared out of nowhere, gliding silently along the old, disused tracks that cut through the woods. The train, covered in thick fog, seemed to carry with it the souls of the departed, and it was said that anyone who boarded would never be seen again. This legend fascinated Lily, a young woman who had grown up in Silverwood. She had always been drawn to the macabre, her curiosity often leading her to places others avoided. On Halloween night, she received a peculiar letter in her mailbox. The envelope was aged, the paper inside yellowed and fragile. The letter was addressed to her in an elegant, old-fashioned script, and inside, it simply read, "The midnight train arrives at Silverwood Station at the stroke of 12. Be there, if you dare." Lily's heart raced as she read the letter. She had heard the stories, of course, but they were just that, stories. Legends meant to frighten children. But the letter felt real, as if it had been written specifically for her. As the day turned to evening, Lily couldn't shake the feeling of anticipation that grew within her. She knew she had to go. She had to see the midnight train for herself. Chapter 2, The Departure. The night was cold and dark, the moon hidden behind thick clouds. Lily wrapped herself in a long coat and made her way to the old Silverwood station, which had been abandoned for decades. The platform was covered in ivy, and the tracks were rusty and overgrown. The station was a ghost of its former self, a relic of a time when trains were the lifeblood of the town. As she arrived at the platform, she noticed she wasn't alone. A handful of other people had gathered, all of them looking as uneasy as she felt. They were strangers to her, but something told her they had received the same invitation. The minutes dragged on, and the air grew colder. The only sound was the wind whistling through the trees. Then, at the stroke of midnight, the ground beneath them began to tremble. A distant whistle echoed through the night, growing louder and more ominous by the second. Out of the darkness, the midnight train appeared, gliding silently along the tracks. It was an imposing black locomotive, its windows dark and its exterior covered in a thick layer of fog. The train came to a halt at the platform with an eerie, almost unnatural stillness. The door of the nearest carriage creaked open, revealing nothing but pitch blackness inside. The group hesitated, but then, as if compelled by some unseen force, they began to board. Lily was the last to step inside, her heart pounding in her chest. As soon as her foot touched the floor of the train, the door slammed shut behind her, and the train began to move. Chapter 3, The Passengers inside the carriage. The atmosphere was heavy with dread. The windows were fogged up, and the dim light that flickered from the old-fashioned lanterns barely illuminated the interior. The seats were upholstered in faded velvet, and the air smelled of dust and decay. The other passengers sat in silence, their faces pale and drawn. Lily took a seat near the back, trying to make sense of what was happening. She glanced around, noticing that the others seemed just as confused and frightened as she was. No one spoke, as if they were all afraid to break the silence, as the train rumbled through the night. The fog outside grew thicker, obscuring any view of the world beyond. The only sound was the rhythmic clatter of the wheels on the tracks, a sound that seemed to grow louder and more oppressive with each passing minute. Lily tried to calm herself, telling herself that it was just a train ride, that the stories were just legends. But deep down, she knew something was terribly wrong. Suddenly, the carriage door at the far end creaked open, and a figure stepped inside. It was a tall man, dressed in a black conductor's uniform, his face obscured by the shadow of his hat. He walked down the aisle, his footsteps unnervingly quiet on the wooden floor. As he passed each passenger, he stopped, looking down at them as if searching for something. Lily's heart raced as he approached her. When he reached her seat, he paused, and for a moment, she thought she saw a flicker of recognition in his eyes. "Ticket, please," he said, his voice low and raspy. Lily fumbled in her pocket, but of course, she had no ticket. She had received no instructions other than to be at the station. The conductor waited, his gaze never leaving her. "I don't have a ticket," Lily whispered, her voice trembling. The conductor didn't respond. Instead, he reached into his coat and pulled out a small, tattered ticket. He handed it to her with a smile that sent a chill down her spine. "This is your ticket," he said softly. "It's a one-way journey." Lily took the ticket, her hands shaking. The conductor moved on, leaving her alone with her thoughts. The words "one-way journey" echoed in her mind, filling her with a sense of foreboding. Chapter 4. The journey begins. As the train continued its journey through the night, Lily's anxiety grew. She clutched the ticket in her hand, staring at it as if it held the answers she so desperately needed. The words were faded, barely legible, but she could make out a single phrase: destination, the end of the line. Lily had no idea where the train was headed, but she knew it wasn't to any place she wanted to go. She looked around the carriage again, noticing that some of the other passengers were now quietly weeping, while others stared blankly ahead, as if resigned to their fate. The fog outside the windows swirled and shifted, creating eerie shapes that seemed to press against the glass. Occasionally, Lily thought she saw faces in the mist, pale and ghostly, their eyes wide with terror. Suddenly, the train jolted, and the lights flickered. The passengers gasped in unison, fear gripping them as the carriage plunged into darkness. For a few agonizing moments, the only sound was the clattering of the wheels on the tracks and the heavy breathing of the passengers. Then, just as suddenly as they had gone out, the lights flickered back on. But something was different. The carriage, once empty save for the passengers, was now filled with a strange, unsettling presence. Lily turned her head slowly, her heart pounding. In the seat across from her sat a woman, her skin pale as death, her eyes wide and unblinking. Her clothes were tattered, and her hair hung in matted clumps around her face. She stared straight ahead, her mouth moving silently as if she were trying to speak. Lily felt a scream rising in her throat, but she couldn't make a sound. She looked around the carriage, seeing that the other passengers had noticed the new arrivals as well. Each one of them had a ghostly figure sitting beside them, silent and still, their eyes filled with a sorrow so deep it was almost tangible. The train was now filled with the dead. Chapter 5. The haunted past. Lily's mind raced as she tried to make sense of what she was seeing. The woman sitting across from her looked so real, yet so impossibly spectral. Lily felt an overwhelming sense of sadness emanating from her, as if she were trying to communicate some deep, unresolved pain. The train continued its relentless journey, the fog outside growing thicker and darker. The other passengers were frozen in their seats, their eyes fixed on the apparitions that now accompanied them. No one dared to move or speak. Lily forced herself to look at the woman across from her, summoning the courage to ask the question that burned in her mind. "Who are you?" Lily whispered, her voice barely audible. The woman's lips trembled, and for a moment, Lily thought she wouldn't respond. But then, in a voice that seemed to come from somewhere far away, she spoke. "I was once like you," the woman said, her voice hauntingly soft. "Curious, unafraid, until I boarded this train." Lily felt a chill run down her spine. "What happened to you?" she asked, her fear momentarily forgotten in her desperation to understand. The woman's eyes filled with tears. "I became trapped," she said. "This train, it doesn't just take you somewhere. It takes your soul. I've been on this journey for so long, unable to leave, unable to rest." Lily's heart pounded in her chest. "But why? Why does it do this?" The woman shook her head. "I don't know. No one knows. All I know is that once you're on this train, there's no escape. It feeds on your fear, your pain, your regret. It's as if the train is alive, and it thrives on the souls it collects." Lily felt a wave of nausea wash over her. She looked around the carriage, seeing the same sorrowful expression on the faces of the other apparitions. They were